The scorching summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a struggling settlement perched on the edge of civilization in the Arizona Territory. William Thatcher, a weathered man of 45 with steel-gray eyes that had witnessed too much hardship, dismounted from his chestnut mare with practiced ease. The journey had been long, and both man and beast were coated in a fine layer of trail dust that spoke of miles conquered and hardships endured. William adjusted his worn leather hat, squinting at the ramshackle buildings that comprised the town's sole street. He had come a long way from the orphanage in Boston, where he'd spent his childhood, and even further from the battlefields of the war between the states, where he'd lost what remained of his innocence. Now, 15 years after the war's end, he found himself in this remote outpost with nothing but 9 cents in his pocket and a deed to a dead man's cabin. The deed had arrived unexpectedly at the Kansas City post office, where William had been working odd jobs. The yellowed envelope contained a brief letter from a lawyer in St. Louis, explaining that an elderly prospector named Jeremiah Blackwood had left William his cabin and all its contents. The lawyer's note mentioned that Blackwood had once known William's mother before she died, giving birth to him at the orphanage. The connection was tenuous and mysterious, but it was the only link William had ever discovered to his unknown past. The deed came with a strange stipulation. William would need to pay 9 cents to the town clerk of Redemption Creek to finalize the transfer of ownership. It seemed a peculiar formality, but William had nothing left to lose, having buried his wife Sarah 3 winters ago after a bout of pneumonia stole her away. Their only child, a daughter named Emma, had died years earlier of scarlet fever. The memory of their graves in the Kansas City cemetery still haunted him, 2 small markers that represented all he had ever truly possessed in this world. "You look like you've come a fair piece, stranger," called a gravelly voice from the shade of the general store's porch. The speaker was a barrel-chested man with a magnificent white mustache that curled at the ends and a silver badge pinned to his vest that identified him as Sheriff Thomas Rawlins. His eyes, though friendly enough, held the cautious assessment of a lawman who had learned to take the measure of newcomers quickly. William nodded respectfully and approached, his spurs jingling softly with each deliberate step. "Name's William Thatcher," he replied, offering a calloused hand that spoke of hard work and harder living. "I've come about the Blackwood cabin. I understand it's mine now, though I need to pay 9 cents to make it official." The sheriff's expression shifted subtly, a shadow of something, concern perhaps, or wariness, crossing his weathered features. "Blackwood's place? That's about 15 miles west of here, up in the foothills. Been empty since they found old Jeremiah face down in Cedar Creek last spring. Curious thing, him leaving it to someone from back east." William followed the sheriff into the clerk's office, a stuffy room dominated by dusty ledgers and the persistent buzzing of flies. The town clerk, a thin man named Simmons, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, listened to William's story with undisguised curiosity. 9 cents is mighty specific," Simmons remarked as he shuffled through a drawer for the appropriate forms. Blackwood was peculiar that way, insisted on that amount when he registered his will. William placed the coins on the desk, the copper warm from being carried in his pocket. As Simmons counted them with bony fingers, William noticed the clerk and sheriff exchange a meaningful glance. "Is there something I should know about this property?" William asked directly, years of hard living having taught him to address problems head-on. The sheriff cleared his throat uncomfortably. "It's just that Blackwood's place sits near what the local tribes consider sacred land. There's been, incidents. Nothing serious, mind you, but peculiar happenings that folk around here don't much care to discuss." The clerk pushed a freshly signed deed across the desk, but his reluctance was palpable. "You might want to consider selling, Mr. Thatcher. I know a few land speculators who'd take it off your hands, sight unseen." William folded the deed carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. I appreciate the concern, gentlemen, but that cabin's the only thing I own in this world. More importantly, it might hold answers about my family that I've been seeking my whole life." As William turned to leave, the sheriff placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Word of advice, Thatcher. The Indians around here, Apaches, Navajo, even some tribes from much farther away, they all steer clear of that ridge where Blackwood built his place. They say the land speaks to those who know how to listen, and what it says isn't always pleasant. Blackwood claimed he could hear it. Toward the end, he wasn't right in the head. Talked about guardians and ancient promises. Just watch yourself out there." William spent the night at the town's only boarding house, a modest establishment run by a widow named Martha Jenkins. Over a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and surprisingly decent coffee, he listened to the local gossip, hoping to glean more information about Jeremiah Blackwood and the cabin he'd inherited. The other boarders grew noticeably quiet when William mentioned his destination. Finally, an old-timer with a prospector's weathered face leaned across the table. "I knew Jeremiah some," he offered in a voice rough from years of hard living. "Wasn't always crazy, though that's what folks came to think of him. He found something up there in those hills. Not gold or silver like he was originally seeking. Something else changed him. He started collecting books, strange artifacts, had visitors sometimes, Indians from tribes I'd never even seen before. They'd come at night, quiet-like, bearing gifts and speaking in whispers. After a while, Jeremiah stopped coming to town, except for absolute necessities. Last time I saw him, his eyes had a faraway look, like he was seeing things the rest of us couldn't. The next morning dawned clear and promising, with just enough chill in the air to remind William that autumn was approaching. He set out early, following the sheriff's directions along a seldom-used trail that wound westward into increasingly rugged terrain. The landscape gradually transformed from semi-arid plains to rocky foothills dotted with juniper and pinon pines. By midday, he could make out a thin column of smoke rising from a distant ridge. A forest fire, perhaps, or possibly a sign of human habitation. As William urged his mare forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Twice, he turned suddenly in the saddle, scanning the surrounding terrain, but saw nothing beyond the occasional desert jackrabbit or circling hawk. Yet the sensation persisted, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. It was nearly sunset when William finally crested a rocky rise and caught his first glimpse of what was now his property. The cabin was sturdier than he had expected, built of thick logs with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. A corral stood empty beside it, and a well-maintained vegetable garden suggested that someone had been tending the place since Blackwood's death. As William approached, he noticed strange symbols carved into the doorframe and peculiar arrangements of stones forming patterns in the yard. Most curious of all was a circle of what appeared to be different-colored soils or sands, forming an intricate design just before the cabin steps. Despite his exhaustion, William felt a reluctance to cross this threshold as the day's last light cast long shadows across the clearing. Nearby, a spring bubbled from between rocks, forming a small but vibrant oasis in the otherwise harsh landscape. The sound of the water was soothing, almost melodic, and for a moment William thought he heard whispered voices carried on the breeze. He dismounted cautiously, leading his mare to drink while he surveyed what was now his home. The isolation was complete. From this vantage point, no other human dwelling was visible in any direction. Just wilderness, mountains, and sky painted in spectacular sunset hues that took his breath away. For the first time since receiving the deed, William wondered if perhaps fortune had finally smiled upon him. The interior of the cabin was a single room with a small loft accessible by a ladder. William lit the oil lamp hanging by the door, revealing a space that was surprisingly tidy and well-appointed. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner beside a rocking chair, and a bookshelf crammed with volumes. A rough-hewn table stood in the center, its surface covered with maps, journals, and curious objects, stones with strange markings, feathers bound with colored thread, small carved figurines of animals and human forms. The bed in the corner was neatly made with thick wool blankets, as if Blackwood had expected to return. Most striking was the collection of artifacts displayed on every available surface. Arrowheads of various designs, clay pots with geometric patterns, woven baskets, and what appeared to be ceremonial items of unknown purpose. The walls themselves were covered with drawings, intricate diagrams, star charts, and symbols that William couldn't begin to decipher. In the dim lamplight, these images seemed to shift and move, creating an unsettling sensation of being surrounded by something alive and watching. William's attention was drawn to a leather-bound journal prominently placed on the table, open to a page filled with Blackwood's spidery handwriting. "To whoever finds this dwelling after my passing," it began, "know that you stand at a crossroads between worlds." William sank into the chair, fatigue momentarily forgotten as he read on. "I, Jeremiah Blackwood, once came to this place seeking gold, but found something far more valuable: knowledge of the ancient ones who walked these lands long before any living tribe. The ground beneath this cabin covers the entrance to what the natives call the Whispering Cave, a place where the veil between our world and the spirit realm grows thin. For 30 years, I have served as its protector, a responsibility passed to me by a dying Apache shaman who recognized in me the ability to hear the earth's voice. Now that duty must fall to another, someone of the right bloodline, someone who can recognize the truth when it speaks in dreams and whispers." The journal continued with increasingly bizarre accounts of visitations and messages that Blackwood claimed to have received from entities he alternately described as guardians, ancient ones or spirit guides. He documented meetings with tribal elders from across the continent who made pilgrimages to this remote spot, each acknowledging its significance in their own traditions. According to Blackwood, representatives from nearly 100 different tribes had visited over the decades, all treating the site with reverence and bringing offerings. Most disturbing were Blackwood's references to William himself, written years before they could possibly have known of each other's existence. "The orphan child of Mary Thatcher will come when I am gone," one entry read. "His blood carries the old knowing, though he is unaware. The guardians have shown me his face in visions. He will resist his calling at first, as all true guardians do, but the land will speak to him as it spoke to me, and he will understand the weight and honor of his inheritance." William closed the journal with trembling hands, his mind reeling. Mary Thatcher. Could that truly have been his mother's name? The orphanage records had listed her only as Mary, with no surname provided. And how could Blackwood have known about him? Was this elaborate hoax, or was there something to these wild claims? Outside, the wind had risen, causing the cabin to creak and settle. To William's overtaxed senses, it almost sounded like whispering voices, speaking just at the edge of comprehension. He shook himself, attributing the notion to exhaustion and the power of suggestion after reading Blackwood's fantastical accounts. He needed sleep, needed to approach this situation with a clear head in the morning light. Yet as he prepared for bed, William couldn't ignore the peculiar feeling of belonging that had settled over him, as if, after a lifetime of wandering, he had finally found the place where he was meant to be. Despite the strangeness, despite the unsettling claims in Blackwood's journal, the cabin felt more like home than any place he had known since childhood. William woke suddenly in the darkest hour of night, his heart pounding. Something had disturbed his sleep, a sound, perhaps, or a presence sensed rather than seen. The cabin was pitch black, the lamp having burned out, but moonlight filtered through the single window, casting silvery patterns across the floor. William lay perfectly still, listening intently. There, he heard it again, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails gently drumming on wood. It seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, directly under his bed. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by what William could only describe as whispering. Multiple voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, rising and falling like waves against a shore. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the night's chill. He had lived through war and its horrors, had faced armed men and wild beasts, but something about these disembodied voices struck a primal fear in him that he hadn't experienced since childhood. Summoning his courage, William lit a candle with shaking hands and investigated the source of the sounds. The floor beneath his bed appeared solid, with no visible trapdoor or access point. Yet when he pressed his ear to the rough wooden planks, the whispering became more distinct, though no more comprehensible. Moving the bed aside with considerable effort, William examined the floorboards more closely. One board seemed slightly different from the others, the grain pattern interrupted, the edges more worn. Using his hunting knife, he managed to pry it up, revealing a small cavity containing a metal box. The whispering stopped the moment he lifted the board, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. With mounting apprehension, William removed the box and placed it on the table. It was made of copper, green with age, its surface etched with the same strange symbols he had seen on the doorframe. A simple latch held it closed, unprotected by lock or key. Inside the box, nested on a bed of what appeared to be various colored soils, lay three objects: a small leather pouch, a folded piece of yellowed parchment, and a peculiar stone pendant on a leather cord. The pendant immediately caught William's attention, a flat oval stone of deep green, polished to a high shine with a spiral pattern carved into its surface. When he hesitantly touched it, the stone felt unnaturally warm, as if it had been sitting in sunshine rather than buried beneath floorboards. William carefully unfolded the parchment to reveal a hand-drawn map. It showed the cabin and surrounding terrain in meticulous detail, with one location marked prominently, a cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall, approximately a mile to the north. Alongside the drawing were instructions written in the same hand as Blackwood's journal. At the full moon, when the sentinel stars align above the split peak, take the speaking stone to the Cave of Whispers. Place the sacred soils in the pattern of the 7 directions. Only then will the guardians reveal themselves and the truth of your inheritance. The leather pouch contained what William assumed were the sacred soils mentioned in the instructions, 7 small compartments filled with earth of different colors and textures. As he examined these curious items, a gust of wind rattled the cabin windows with sudden ferocity. Outside, the previously clear night had transformed dramatically. Dark clouds raced across the moon, and in the distance, lightning flashed silently among the mountains. The abrupt change in weather sent another chill of unease through William. Acting on instinct, he quickly returned everything to the box, replaced it in its hiding place, and pushed the bed back into position. Only then did he notice the date marked on Blackwood's calendar hanging beside the door. Tomorrow night would bring the full moon mentioned in the instructions. Sleep was impossible now, with his mind churning over all he had discovered. William sat in Blackwood's rocking chair until dawn, watching the mysterious storm dissipate as suddenly as it had formed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and studded with fading stars. Morning brought clarity and doubt in equal measure. In daylight, William questioned his experiences of the night before. Had he truly heard whispering beneath the floorboards, or had it been the wind finding its way through cracks in the cabin's construction? Were Blackwood's writings the product of a rational mind, or the delusions of a man driven to madness by isolation? William spent the day exploring the property, finding evidence that supported at least some of Blackwood's claims. Behind the cabin, a narrow trail led up to a small plateau, where stone markers formed a perfect circle around a fire pit lined with clay. The arrangement matched one of the diagrams on Blackwood's wall, what he had labeled as a council circle, where he supposedly met with tribal representatives. Further exploration revealed other sites marked on Blackwood's maps. A natural spring surrounded by handprints painted on adjacent rocks, a grove of ancient junipers with offerings of tobacco and beads hanging from their gnarled branches, and a high point with a panoramic view where stone cairns stood like silent sentinels watching over the land. Most compelling was the waterfall indicated on the map from the copper box. William found it exactly where Blackwood had drawn it, a slender cascade tumbling over red rock into a clear pool. From certain angles, the fall concealed what might indeed be a cave entrance, yet William hesitated to investigate further, an uncharacteristic caution holding him back. Instead, he returned to the cabin as afternoon shadows lengthened across the landscape. He spent hours reading more of Blackwood's journals, each entry adding to the incredible narrative of a site considered sacred by dozens of tribes from across the continent. According to Blackwood, the Whispering Cave contained a phenomenon that defied explanation, a place where one could hear the voices of ancestors speaking across time, offering wisdom and warnings to those with the gift to hear. Most intriguing were references to William's mother, Mary Thatcher, described as a young woman who had briefly stayed with Blackwood while traveling west, already carrying the child who would one day return to this place. Mary possessed the gift strongly, Blackwood wrote, perhaps too strongly for her own peace of mind. She heard the whispers even without entering the cave, and they troubled her deeply. She fled rather than face what they revealed, but the child she carries will be drawn back. The guardians have shown me this truth. As twilight approached, William was startled by a knock at the cabin door, the first human contact since his arrival. Outside stood an elderly Native American man, his face deeply lined by age and weather, his long grey hair braided with strips of red cloth. He leaned on a walking stick, adorned with feathers and beads, and his dark eyes regarded William with unnerving intensity. "I am Joseph Running Bear," the man said in accented but clear English. "I have come a long way to meet the new guardian." William invited him inside with cautious courtesy, noting how the old man's gaze moved knowingly around the cabin, lingering on certain artifacts with apparent recognition. "How did you know I was here?" William asked, pouring coffee for his unexpected guest. Running Bear accepted the cup with gnarled hands that trembled slightly with age. "The spirits speak," he replied simply. "When old Blackwood crossed to the other side, we felt the change. Now the Keeper's stone has been touched by new hands, your hands. Word travels between tribes faster than you might think, especially when it concerns this sacred place." Over the next hour, Running Bear spoke of things that both clarified and deepened the mystery surrounding William's inheritance. The land where the cabin stood had been considered sacred by indigenous peoples for countless generations, a place where the membrane between worlds grew thin, allowing communication with ancestral spirits and beings from the spirit realm. 100 tribes, Running Bear confirmed, nodding at William's question about Blackwood's claim. Not all at once, but over many seasons. Apache, Navajo, Hopi, Ute, Comanche, and many others, even tribes from the far north and east, all recognize the power of the Whispering Cave. All send representatives when called by the spirits. All bring offerings to honor the guardians. When William asked what these guardians were, the old man's expression grew solemn. They are ancient ones who walked this land before any living tribe. Not human as we understand it, but beings of great power who chose to remain when their kind departed. They protect knowledge too dangerous for most to possess, secrets about the nature of existence and powers that could unmake the world if misused. Each guardian chooses a human keeper, one with the right bloodline, the right spirit, to maintain the balance between worlds. Night had fallen completely by the time Running Bear finished his explanation, the full moon rising magnificent and impossibly large on the eastern horizon. "It is time," the old man said, rising from his chair with surprising agility. "The alignment comes only once each cycle. If you truly are the chosen keeper, You must accept your inheritance tonight, or the opportunity passes to another." William hesitated, torn between skepticism and the undeniable weight of all he had witnessed. "And if I refuse this, responsibility?" Running Bear's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes reflected something like pity. "Then the protection fails. The seal weakens. What is contained may escape. This has happened before, bringing great suffering. It is why the tribes watch so carefully for signs of the new keeper when the old one passes." William thought of the copper box beneath the floorboards, of his mother's name in Blackwood's journal, of the strange connections that had brought him to this remote place. Perhaps there was some truth to this incredible tale. Perhaps this inheritance was more than a simple cabin in the wilderness. "I'll need the stone pendant," he said finally, "and the pouch of colored soils." The night air carried the scent of juniper and sage as William and Running Bear made their way toward the waterfall by moonlight. The old man moved with practiced ease over the difficult terrain, his walking stick finding purchase on the rocky path with unerring accuracy. Behind them, the cabin was a distant, lonely square of darkness against the starlit landscape. Ahead, the sound of falling water grew steadily louder. William wore the green stone pendant around his neck as instructed, its weight unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting against his chest. The leather pouch of colored soils hung from his belt, bouncing gently against his thigh with each step. Neither man spoke during the journey, yet William sensed an increasingly palpable tension as they approached their destination. The air seemed to thicken, to hum with unseen energy that raised gooseflesh on his arms despite the night's warmth. Above them, stars blazed with uncommon brilliance, highlighting a distinctive twin-peaked mountain exactly as Blackwood had described, the split peak under which the sentinel stars would align. The waterfall appeared transformed in the moonlight, its cascade seeming to contain fleeting images and patterns as the silver light played through the falling water. The pool below reflected the night sky perfectly, creating the illusion of a bottomless cosmic well. Running Bear led William along a narrow ledge behind the waterfall, where a dark opening gaped in the rock face, the entrance to the Whispering Cave. "I can go no further," the old man announced, pressing something into William's hand, a small bundle of herbs bound with sinew. "Sage for protection. Burn it at the inner threshold. The rest you must do alone, as all keepers before you have done." William peered into the absolute darkness of the cave mouth, fighting an instinctive dread that threatened to overwhelm his usual courage. "What exactly will I find in there?" he asked, his voice nearly lost beneath the roar of the waterfall. Running Bear's expression remained enigmatic in the shifting shadows. "You will find truth, William Thatcher, about the land, about the Guardians, about yourself and your bloodline. Whether that truth brings comfort or sorrow depends on your strength to accept it." William entered the cave alone, a small lantern casting uncertain light that barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. The passage descended steeply, the walls narrowing until he was forced to turn sideways in places to continue forward. The air grew noticeably warmer and carried a peculiar scent, like earth after rain mixed with unfamiliar spices. After what seemed an eternity of careful progress, the narrow tunnel opened suddenly into a vast chamber that stole William's breath away. His lantern light couldn't reach the ceiling, creating the impression of standing beneath an infinite void. The chamber was roughly circular, with a raised stone platform at its center. 7 tunnels radiated outward from this central space like spokes of a wheel. Most astonishing were the walls, covered entirely with paintings and carvings that appeared to span countless different artistic traditions and time periods, some looking remarkably fresh, others faded with extreme age. In the lantern light, these images seemed to undulate subtly, as if alive and breathing. Following Running Bear's instructions, William lit the sage bundle and waited until its pungent smoke filled the air around him. Then he approached the central platform, where 7 shallow depressions had been carved into the stone in a circular pattern. William carefully placed a pinch of each colored soil into its corresponding depression. Red to the east, black to the north, white to the west, yellow to the south, blue above, green below, and in the center, a mixture of all colors. As he completed this ritual, a sound began to fill the chamber, the unmistakable whispering he had heard beneath the floorboards, but magnified 100-fold. Voices speaking in countless languages, overlapping and intertwining, none individually comprehensible, yet somehow conveying a collective meaning that bypassed normal understanding and spoke directly to something deep within William's consciousness. The greenstone pendant at his throat grew warm, then hot against his skin, and began to emit a soft, pulsing light that cast strange shadows across the ancient walls. William stood transfixed as the whispering voices coalesced into a single communication, not in words exactly, but in concepts and images that bloomed in his mind with perfect clarity. He saw the history of this sacred place stretching back into a past so distant it predated human memory. He witnessed beings of light and shadow who walked the earth when it was young, who chose to remain as guardians when their kind departed for realms beyond human comprehension. He understood their purpose, to protect certain knowledge and powers from misuse, to maintain boundaries between worlds that should remain separate, to guide humanity's development without directly interfering in its natural evolution. And he saw the lineage of keepers stretching through centuries, shamans, medicine people, and ordinary individuals with extraordinary sensitivity to the energies that flowed between worlds. Among them, he recognized Jeremiah Blackwood, and before him, countless others dating back to the first human settlements in these lands. Most shockingly, William saw his mother, young, beautiful, and frightened by the gift she possessed. Mary Thatcher had indeed stayed with Blackwood briefly, already carrying the child conceived with a man she had loved and lost to war. Blackwood had recognized her sensitivity immediately and had shown her the Whispering Cave, believing she might become the next keeper after him. But the voices had overwhelmed Mary, revealing truths she wasn't prepared to face, including visions of her own death in childbirth. She had fled, making Blackwood promise to find her child when the time came. A promise he had kept through the mysterious mechanisms of his will and the 9-cent transfer that had drawn William across the continent to his true inheritance. Through this visionary experience, William finally understood why the price had been specifically 9 cents, representing the 9 worlds of certain tribal cosmologies and the 9 generations since the first keeper of his bloodline had accepted this sacred responsibility. When the vision faded, William found himself kneeling on the stone platform, tears streaming down his face from the sheer emotional impact of what he had witnessed. The whispering had subsided to a gentle murmur, like a distant conversation that continued just beyond hearing. The greenstone pendant had cooled against his skin, but continued to emit a soft, steady glow that illuminated the chamber more effectively than his forgotten lantern. William became aware of presences gathering in the shadows at the edges of the light, indistinct forms that were neither fully physical nor completely insubstantial. The guardians, he realized with a certainty that bypassed conscious thought. They had shown themselves to him as they had shown themselves to every keeper before him, waiting for his decision. Would he accept the responsibility of maintaining the boundary between worlds? Would he protect the sacred knowledge contained in this place? Would he serve as intermediary between the ancient guardians and the 100 tribes who honored them? In that moment of choice, William Thatcher, orphan, Civil War veteran, widower, wanderer, felt the weight of his past fall away. The years of searching for belonging, for purpose, for connection to something larger than himself, suddenly made sense as preparation for this role he was now offered. He thought of the empty cabin waiting above, of Blackwood's journals filled with wisdom accumulated over decades of service, of Running Bear, who had traveled far to ensure the transition of responsibility. He thought of his mother, who had possessed the same gift, but had not been strong enough to bear its burden. Most of all, he thought of the 100 tribes who depended on the Keeper to maintain the ancient covenant with the Guardians, protecting both worlds from potential devastation if the boundaries should fail. "I accept," William said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "I accept the responsibility and the honor of serving as Keeper." The response was immediate and overwhelming, a surge of energy that flowed from the shadowy Guardians into the green stone pendant and through it into William himself. Knowledge, understanding, and ability transferred in a torrent that left him gasping. Languages he had never studied became comprehensible. The significance of Blackwood's artifacts and wall diagrams snapped into focus with perfect clarity. The location of every sacred site within 100 miles imprinted itself on his consciousness like a detailed map. Most importantly, he understood his role completely, not merely as caretaker of a physical location, but as custodian of a metaphysical boundary, crucial to the world's continued stability. As this knowledge settled into his being, William felt a profound sense of rightness, as if every hardship and loss in his life had been leading him to this exact moment of transformation. For the first time since childhood, he felt truly complete. When William emerged from the cave hours later, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the landscape in hues of gold and rose. Running Bear waited patiently, sitting cross-legged on a flat rock beside the pool, his weathered face turned toward the rising sun. The old man looked up as William approached, studying him intently, before nodding with evident satisfaction. "It is done," Running Bear said. It wasn't a question. William touched the stone pendant, now cool against his skin, but humming with subtle energy that connected him to both the Guardians and the land itself. "It is done," he confirmed. "I have accepted the responsibility." Running Bear rose stiffly, leaning on his walking stick. "Then I will carry word to the tribes. They will send representatives to meet the new Keeper in due time, bringing offerings and seeking guidance as they have always done." He extended his hand in the white man's gesture of agreement. Until that day, William Thatcher, guardian of the Whispering Cave, keeper of the ancient covenant. The journey back to the cabin seemed shorter, the landscape somehow more vibrant and alive to William's heightened senses. Birds called from the juniper trees in voices that now carried subtle meanings beyond their natural songs. The very rocks and soil beneath his feet pulsed with histories he could almost read like open books. Running Bear departed shortly after their return, promising to spread word of the new Keeper through traditional networks that connected the 100 tribes. Left alone, William stood on the cabin porch, surveying what was now truly his domain in ways far deeper than mere legal ownership. The 9 cents he had paid, a symbolic acknowledgement of cosmic balance rather than actual purchase price, had bought him not just a dead man's cabin, but a living legacy and profound purpose. Blackwood's mysterious bequest made perfect sense now. The old prospector had recognized in William the same bloodline gift that Mary Thatcher had possessed, the sensitivity required to communicate with the Guardians and maintain the boundary between worlds. In the weeks that followed, William settled into his new role with surprising ease. He studied Blackwood's journals thoroughly, now understanding references and instructions that had previously seemed like the ravings of a disturbed mind. He learned to interpret the whispers that occasionally rose from beneath the cabin floorboards, messages and warnings from the Guardians that required his attention or action. He maintained the sacred sites scattered across the surrounding wilderness, renewing protective symbols and replenishing offerings according to ancient protocols. Most importantly, he served as custodian of the Whispering Cave, visiting regularly to ensure the integrity of the boundary it contained. True to Running Bear's prediction, representatives from various tribes began to arrive. Solitary figures who appeared at dawn or dusk, bearing gifts and seeking audience with the new Keeper. They came from near and far, Apache and Navajo from nearby territories, Ute and Shoshone from the north, even Sioux and Cheyenne from the distant plains. each acknowledging William's authority with solemn respect that had nothing to do with race or origin and everything to do with his sacred function. By the time winter settled over the foothills, bringing silent snowfalls and crystalline nights bright with stars, William Thatcher had fully embraced his unexpected destiny. The orphan who had wandered aimlessly after losing his family had found a home and purpose beyond anything he could have imagined. The cabin that had cost him 9 cents had revealed its true value, not in gold or silver, but in sacred trust and ancient wisdom. On cold evenings, as he added entries to what was now his own journal beside Blackwood's extensive records, William sometimes thought about the peculiar sequence of events that had led him here. He had once believed himself utterly alone in the world, yet now understood he was part of a lineage stretching back through centuries, connected to a responsibility that transcended ordinary human concerns. The 100 tribes that protected the secret of the Whispering Cave had become his extended family, their traditions and knowledge gradually becoming part of his expanding consciousness. In the firelight, William often removed the green stone pendant from around his neck, studying its spiraling pattern that seemed to contain infinite depth when viewed in certain ways. Through this simple object, he remained connected to the Guardians, to the land, and to his own unexpected heritage. "If you like this story," he sometimes whispered to the empty room, knowing the Guardians could hear, "please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments." To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. It was his private joke, a small irreverence that the Guardian seemed to tolerate with what he sensed was amused indulgence. Then William would replace the pendant against his skin, bank the fire for the night, and step outside to gaze at the star-filled sky above his remote domain. The orphan who had found not just a home, but a sacred calling in a dead man's cabin purchased for 9 copper cents.